All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to slightly shift from what we've done in the morning. In the morning, we had a fantastic lecture with long-term trends and issues, and really good lecture by Hippolyte Vovchak, and we had some very interesting pieces of research in the morning. Now, this afternoon, we will have a panel discussion on the AfCFTA, and we're extremely fortunate that Jonathan Rosenthal has agreed to moderate this session. And Jonathan Rosenthal, you will probably all know him. He's the Africa editor at The Economist, and that's a very informative section always on Africa in the Economist, and which we of course all read and with great interest around trade, investment issues, and we're also interested to understand now the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So let me hand over to Jonathan to chair this session, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And yes, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here. And the reason is just because this is, such a key issue. It's certainly one that we spend a lot of time thinking about, as no doubt do you. I'm going to bring up the panelists. The little secret that I have to share about being the editor is that actually editors are quite lazy people. We don't know very much ourselves. We rely on having sort of good correspondence in the field and marshalling them. And so today we also have a fantastic panel. So my job will really be to try and stay out of their way as much as possible and let them share their insights. So if I could ask you all to please come up. We've got Dirk, we've got Professor Velde, and I'm afraid I'm not going to go through everyone's CVs if that's okay. And I'd like to keep things sort of flowing and informal. We've got His Excellency the Ambassador, Tarefi Desta, OP. Online, we've got Agnes Gitau. I believe I'm not sure if MES is going to still get here in time, but we can but hope. And we've got Dominic also online. So so welcome all. I think we all sort of know well what the enormous upside is of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and in particular at a time when we are seeing sort of huge dislocation, fragmentation of trade, various crises, not least Russia, Ukraine, and the like. So we know what the prize is, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. But it also seems to me, and I'm going to hope that I will be proved slightly wrong here, that this prize is elusively out of reach. So I'd like us to sort of focus on not just what are the wins and the gains and what's to play for, but what needs to happen to grab those gains. What really needs to be done to speed it up. And I'm going to start. I'd like to give you each a few minutes. Let's try and keep it to about 4 or 5, just to outline what you see as the key priorities, a rough assessment of where we are. And let's just start the conversation with that. So Dirk.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. So there were about 4 questions for the panel, and I'll just frame them briefly with some introductory remarks, and I'll hope to be brief. So first of all, what are the opportunities? And I think Jonathan mentioned that. And so analysis has suggested that if we implement the AfCFTA in full, including complementary measures, including trade facilitation measures, some trade-related infrastructure, then Africa would gain by about 8% in GDP terms. So that's a massive gain. I mean, I used to work on WTO issues and the impact of WTO trade liberalization. We were talking about 0.3% of GDP for the world as a whole. We're now talking about 8%. Of course, if it's not as comprehensive as some of the studies suggest, it is less. Nonetheless, the price is high. And the expectations are that it would lead to industrialization, economic transformation, and also the building of regional value chains. So those are the expectations. There are also political benefits that could be there. So more integration could so physical integration, economic integration could lead to political integration as well. And there could be more collaboration. We've done work on the Berbera corridor, perhaps that could lead to more collaboration between Somalia and Somaliland. AfCFTA can lead to an Africa voice at the global stage in a range of fora, and particularly now with global shocks, so that's important as well. And AfCFTA can lead to more resilience of African countries by transforming their economies. So those are some pretty big benefits. What has been the scope so far of African integration? And we're looking at that, and we're supporting also a range of actors on the negotiations and implementation of the AfCFTA through the work that I've done at ODI. So I'm joined professor of practice here at SOAS, and I'm also at ODI. And we're looking at the project, work on the projects supported by the FCDO that support negotiations. And here we have so-called phase 1 negotiations on trading goods. They still need to be finalized, at least the rules, some rules of origin on some of the goods need to be finalized. But there's some progress, and that actually some trade under AfCFTA rules is happening. So so-called guided trade initiative, in which some countries have taken part already. So about 8 countries, 96 products, and the expectations is that it will be extended significantly to quite a number of countries later this year. 47 countries have already ratified the AfCFTA, and all except one have signed it. Phase 2 protocols. So these are going beyond trading goods and services and include areas around intellectual property rights, investment, competition, and now also digital trade. And some of them are finalized or close to finalization. And that's quite significant for African countries, because not all of the countries have been looking at these beyond the border issues, have been looking at these deeper integration issues. And they're pretty important, because the literature tells us that regional integration only really benefits countries if it's deep integration. So there's some progress there already. The other good news, perhaps, is that that African countries aren't only thinking about this in a narrow trade sense, narrow trade agreement, but actually also in terms of wider instruments. And we had an African bank, so the adjustment fund, or a Pan-Africa system, payment system. So there are other instruments that complement trade integration. And so that this is not just a trade agreement, but it's more. And that's also how leaders are looking at this. The expectations are there that they'd like to see this as a movement, as it were, that is doing more than just trade integration, and that it really leads to industrialization. AfCFTA can also be a catalyst to become more open. And we've seen, for example, Nigeria signing up. It took time, but they have done. Tanzania also signing up more, and there are a range of other countries who've become more open in the process, and AfCFTA has been a catalyst of that. But I must say, and I agree with you, Jonathan, that we are at a crossroads now. So there are all of these expectations there, and the leaders have signed it. Many leaders have signed this agreement and ratified it. But we need to be careful of, is this going to be a trade agreement that is perhaps half implemented, because we aren't there yet, and not all countries have ratified it, or is this really going to be the promised instrument that is going to really transform economies? And here, implementation will be absolutely key. And here it's about national implementation committees at national level and regional economic communities. So we need to build on the implementation structures that are there, and there's progress there. And some countries have taken the lead, like Ghana, for example, in terms of national implementation committees. But there are quite a few laggards countries on the continent, and we need to see more movement on that. And I think we're on the crossroads this year, and perhaps in the coming years, we really need to move to implementation of the AfCFTA agreement. 2 final comments. Questions on how can the AfCFTA help African countries to become more resilient? Well, the AfCFTA can transform economies through faster intra-Africa trade and investment, particularly manufactured goods, so that can transform the economies, can make them more resilient to crisis and commodity dependence. Trade can help with food security. I mean, we were hosting a seminar on Somalia in Nairobi 1 or 2 weeks ago. Tariffs on food products are still 35%, so pretty high. If in the AfCFTA they can be reduced, that can help with food security. Trade can also help with the climate crisis. For example, the investment protocol has has a chapter on investment facilitation, particularly for sustainable finance. Finally, a question is about how can the UK perhaps support these efforts. First of all, they can think about a trade policy. So they have a developing country trading scheme, which provides preferences, and perhaps that can be applied more Africa-wide. We will hear more on that from David Luke, perhaps later in his book launch as well. There's the Africa Investment Summit taking place in April 2024, which is a sequel to the one in 2020, and perhaps that can lead to more investment. And our work at ODI research suggests that full implementation of the AfCFTA, full implementation is likely to lead to a 25% in the stock of foreign direct investment from the UK in Africa through a range of channels that I can explain more. Aid. There is still aid, although it has declined recently. There's still hope for the future, and development finance institutions such as BAI, which promised they would finance about £2 billion pounds worth of finance in Africa in the coming 2 years. And then I think it's important to bring this all together. And so market access on its own isn't enough. Finance on its own isn't enough, and policies on their own aren't enough. It's when you bring them together. It's changing policies, putting in place special economic zones, thinking about finance that is needed to finance infrastructure, but also think about market access. And if you bring that together, then the UK can perhaps have a good comparative advantage that it can show to African countries at the African Investment Summit next April, that it can then harness the interest of African countries in economic transformation and job creation. But it's really important that AfCFTA gets implemented and that we can see the signs of implementation. We're beginning to see some of them, but we'd like to see more.
Thank you, Dirk. I think that sort of sets the scene fantastically and gives us plenty of questions to delve into. Okay, I'm going to come to you next, since you're right here. But I suppose moving on from where Dirk started, which is a fairly positive but actually quite high level set of priorities. I'm quite curious to see or to hear what sort of your experience is at the Secretariat in terms of sort of member countries and dealing slightly closer to the coalface with these issues.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody. I think that you've basically covered everything everybody else was supposed to say, Dirk. That was not very nice of you. But anyways, yeah, I think that the AfCFTA, and Dirk has nicely laid out some of the advantages that we could harness if that agreement is fully implemented. And the question is if or when, and the question is how. There's quite a lot that's gone into the development of the agreement, the member states, the agreements. But one of the things that we're seeing is that the challenges, especially around the issues of trade facilitation, still subsist very much in the region. I mean, just 2 days ago, I was reading an article in a Nigerian newspaper where the Shippers Council had reported that between a trade corridor from the border of Nigeria, Badagry, to Ivory Coast, there were 57 checkpoints to pass through if you wanted to move goods to Ivory Coast. That's a huge amount of checkpoints for any kind of trade activity. So the practical realities are that some of these challenges are still subsisting. But again, the good news is that the policymakers are thinking very carefully about how they want to overcome some of these challenges. So, for example, the reporting mechanism that's been put in place for NTBs should hopefully help to identify where these pressure points are along the trade corridors and see how countries can potentially respond to take away some of those obstacles. For me, I think that Africa is a very important region for the Commonwealth. As many of you should know, some non-Commonwealth member states are here, so I see you. But of the 56 countries in Africa, or in the Commonwealth, 21 of them are African countries. Many of these countries are landlocked. Many of them are LDCs. Very many of them are still exporters of commodities, whether that be minerals or agricultural products. So for us, one of the key things that we are doing, which we think is critical, is the issue of diversification. And this is where the value of the AfCFTA is. It's that ability for countries to move up the value chain, to really translate the opportunities that's in the tariff books has been negotiated into actual gains for the MSMEs who trade, because governments don't trade. Governments could sit and design the policies. It is the enterprises that trade. And so the reality is for us, the core value that we see is the support we provide to countries to see how they can diversify their exports. In Africa, we've been quite active supporting the development of export diversification strategies. We've done in Botswana, in Malawi, in Gambia, in Nigeria. But one more thing that we're going ahead, to do is beyond diversification, which many countries really think about in terms of trading goods, to start looking at diversification from a services perspective. Now, again, the AfCFTA agreement does identify 5 key services sectors where they want to see increased liberalization. And we think that this is one area where many countries can potentially expand the scope of their ability to take advantage of the AfCFTA agreement, because it covers both trading goods and trading services. And you've spoken about industrialization, participation in regional value chains. I think one of the things that for me and for us in the Commonwealth we're seeing, or we're tracking, for example, is there's been a lot of talk about the carbon transition. And this speaks to the question of resilience, about the fact that we need to go as a globe to more environmentally friendly goods. And the research has shown that in Africa, we have a lot of these metals that would go into creating less carbon emitting goods, cobalt, manganese, and all of that, with very, very huge deposits in Africa. So my question is to African policymakers, are we again going to stay at the bottom part of the value chain where we export these metals to the developed countries where they are then used, or are we going to use that opportunity to facilitate investment in country? So not just exporting the metals as raw commodities to be used, but bringing those into Africa, bringing the companies to invest in Africa, to set up those factories, those for the creation of this industrial dream that we have of the AfCFTA facilitating. So for me, these are the key core areas that I think would be interesting to track as we look to the implementation of the AfCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, OP. Again, you raised some key issues, and the one is NTBs, which I'd like us to come back to. And when we do, I'm sure Agnes will have a lot to say on that, because in particular, the EAC has been doing some interesting and good work on that. But I think you raise some key points. I guess a common theme between sort of what we've just heard from both of you is I suppose a question of political will and commitment by member states to actually driving this through. And perhaps I wonder if that's a point where we can bring in the ambassador, which is really, what is your sense, not just of your own government, but of other governments in the region, towards actually, it's not just about doing the hard work, it's about making the hard political choices and perhaps taking on some sort of hard or tough, domestic interests in order to do this. What is your sense of kind of where, members stand?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me say something about the state of things in Africa first before I move into the opportunities and the scope of integration. As you might know, Africa is the second most populous country next to Asia, continent next to Asia. Let me state some statistics. It has a population of 1.3 billion people, 18% of the world, with a median age of 19 years. The youth forming 65%. It's expected to reach 2.5 billion by the year 2050, constituting 25% of the global total. Africa is also at a very low level of development, save internal variables in terms of infrastructure, industrialization, technology, education, manpower, development, and use of ICT as well. The continent is the second largest in terms of its size next to Asia as well. It forms 65% of the global arable land, with diverse archaeology suitable for plant and animal production. It's almost its most resource-rich continent endowed with rivers, animal production, wood forests, diamonds, golds, minerals that my colleague has mentioned from here. Africa is also one of the fastest growing economies in the world, only next to Asia in 2023. However, its GDP accounts only 2.8% of the world's nominal GDP. Its GDP is close to USD 3 trillion. Regionally, its growth prospect is even better than most, and it's considered as the next growth frontier. Africa forms a sheer 3% of global trade in merchandise goods and services. Its share is almost the minimum in the intermediate, manufactured, and digitalized goods trade. Its export products are largely raw materials, minerals, and intermediate goods to a smaller extent. Africa's level of integration is very low, as mentioned. Intra-African trade accounts for a mere 20%, while the balance is trade with the rest of the world. This intra-Africa trade pattern has shown an 18.6% relative growth in 2022, reaching USD 193 billion USD. With regards to integration, historically, regional integration is usually a phased process and constitutes free trade, customs union, common market, economic union, and political union. The 5 regional economic communities in Africa have been stepping stones for the current AfCFTA. It's also taken as a milestone in the realization of the Agenda 2063 and achieving the Africa we want envisioned by African leaders. AfCFTA is the largest free trade, probably next to WTO. It intends to create a single continental market by eliminating trade barriers and boosting the level of integration. As such, it is different from the kinds of integration Africa has practiced so far. Despite this, the Regional Integration Index, ARII, averaged out at 3.279, which is far below the average of other continents. AfCFTA was established in 2018 following the African Free Trade Agreement by the African Union and fully endorsed by 54 countries, out of which 46 have ratified the agreement. Ethiopia is one of the ratifying countries and established a free trade zone in the eastern part of the city of Dirk in 2022. Ethiopia is pursuing investment, customs and tax, financial sector, and business environment reforms to facilitate free trade and investment, among other things. It's also pushing ahead with digitalization, infrastructure development, electricity sharing with neighboring countries, and macroeconomic policy revitalization. Africa is a growing, huge market for intra-Africa trade and beyond, which allows for scaling and scoping of production. It will also allow the inflow of FDI, technology, industrialization, value-added production, and exports if taken as an integrated market, which the AfCFTA strives to achieve. Talent and experience sharing shall be maximized, and digitalization and internal connectivity shall be significantly expanded. In aggregate, Africa's role in the global arena shall be improved and its collective negotiating capacity maximized. The expanded integration within Africa helps to withstand external shocks and enables Africa to develop an internally related and self-supporting dynamic economy. It also lowers, if not eliminates, the level of dependence Africa experiencing today in terms of the capacity to mobilize resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to, if I may, I'm just going to push you slightly, which is your country has taken a sort of huge bet in recent years on, sort of more so than many others, on sort of export led industrial growth. And I'm just quite keen to get a sense of, a lot of that is through mechanisms such as AGOA and exporting into richer countries. I'm just curious as to sort of, how it sees African trade, intra-African trade within the context of the sort of broader, sort of outward trade into the US and the like.
Thank you. Ethiopia is trying to align its policies and regulations with other African countries to facilitate the export of products from Ethiopia to neighboring countries. In Ethiopia, we have started an industrialization phase. We have built close to 15 industrial parks in the country to move to manufacturing. Most of the manufacturing products we do are textile and leather for the at the moment, taking the Asian example like Bangladesh and others, as labor is cheap, energy is cheap in Ethiopia. We're also trying to build our energy supply base in Ethiopia. With the East African Energy Pool, we're trying to share surplus energy to neighboring countries. To Kenya, we're building transmission lines now, and also other neighboring countries. We're building infrastructure to integrate the regional countries so that we can be of interest to investors as a sub-region of close to 200 million people. So these are some of the efforts Ethiopia is trying to do to contribute to the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The other issue I want to mention here is Ethiopian Airlines is building a cargo hub in Addis Ababa. We have been transporting COVID materials during the pandemic to almost all African countries. We have state-of-the-art cargo facility at the airport for fresh products and pharma. So we are trying to position ourselves as a cargo and logistics hub as well. So in such a ways, we are trying to do our best.
Thank you very much. Before I come to you, I'm going to go to the screen, and I'm going to bring in Agnes at this point. Well, you can hold on. It's a bit like sort of Lord of the Flies. Whoever's got the conch gets to speak. And I'm also going to encourage sort of everyone as we get into a freer conversation now to sort of get my attention, and let's make this more of a conversation rather than an interrogation by me. And I'm going to ask for audience participation, both in terms of questions soon, but also since I can't see the people on the screen, if any of them want to sort of raise a hand, could you just sort of wave if you'd like to join a particular point of this conversation, and hopefully people who can see you will tell me. But Agnes, if you could come in, I think just generally, I'd like a bit of your sense of sort of the ECA's experience, but in particular in terms of non-tariff barriers, as OP has pointed out. The ECA is the region that seems to have done better than most at dealing with those. So over to you.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's great to see everybody. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you. I'm in rainy Nairobi today, but really delighted to join in the conversation around AfCFTA and what it holds for the continent. And it often looked like EAC is more advanced, as you said, in terms of integration, but it didn't. It's taken a lot of work, and one of the important things for the East African community, whose members include Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, is the conversation first at political level, but also within the private sector. And despite the fact that the key objective for the EAC is to facilitate movements of goods and services across the borders, non-tariff barriers have always remained a challenge. According to the EAC Secretariat, they say that 26 out of 33 non-tariff barriers have been rectified. But if you ask the traders who cross the border every day, they have a different story to take. But in terms of logistics, I think one of the success stories is the fact that it used to take 21 days to move goods from one post to another. Now it takes you roughly about 4 to 5 days, right? And what have they done in addressing NTBs, and which I think is a challenge for AfCFTA implementation? One of the key focuses was to pass the Act of NTBs elimination. It provides a legal framework to handle and eliminate NTBs. It stipulates mechanism, procedures, and institutional arrangement for identifying, reporting, and timelines for their resolution. Also, the dispute resolution mechanism, whereby member states can always resolve disputes when they occur. Again, as I keep saying, it's conversation and the fact that our politicians understand the importance of an integrated region. And so therefore, they have no choice but to make sure that some of the barriers within them are resolved. Another success story for the region, intra-East Africa trade is about 15% compared to the regional trade, which is around, I think, 12 to 14%, right? So if EAC can work, and I think it's a story for all the regional economic blocks, if one region works, or has shown that there is a possibility of working, and I think there is a way that we can implement the AfCFTA. I know naysayers say, look, it's a lot of talk, very high profile, but when you get to the, particularly amongst traders who have the experience of working with, it's very difficult. I want to highlight, again, challenges, but not for the sake of highlighting them, but to say the importance, and a lot of our speakers who've gone before me have spoken of the opportunities. I see opportunities, particularly in trade facilitation. And one of something I'm very passionate about is access to finance, access to credit. How do SMEs, who make up over 60 to 70% of East African businesses, how can they access finance to be able to move goods from one border to the next? The other important opportunity that private sector and other stakeholders can work on is how do we leverage technology, promote e-commerce, even perhaps artificial intelligence, to try and make sure that there is ease of movement, movement of goods and services. So there are opportunities. I know the other question I think you had asked us to address is, what can stakeholders, including the UK, do? I think for me, as I'm coming from East Africa, it's important that the UK, if they really want to support African state in implementing AfCFTA, is making sure that they negotiate trade agreements at the Africa region level, or from the AfCFTA Secretariat, rather than having an economic partnership with country B without really bringing the whole region to the negotiation. It's a challenge for Kenya. Kenya and the UK have signed an economic agreement partnership, which have set our neighbors, and I believe this has been raised in the EAC. Great opportunities in particularly for private sector. You've talked about diversification, opportunities for promoting light manufacturing. But Jonathan, we can sit here all day and talk about the potential. But what can we do right now to ensure that this incredible and ambitious project benefits the continent? I think for me, it's the issue that we've all raised. How do the traders now move goods from point A to B? 4 out of the 8 countries who are participating in the guided trade initiative are from East Africa. So Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritius, and Rwanda, right? And what the Secretariat is doing is to facilitate and track and audit some of the challenges they go through. So I believe the success or what looks like a success of an integrated East Africa, I think can be replicated across the region. But it takes a lot of work. It will take, we will have to move from high profile talk shop and go to the borders and see and experience what the traders, and listen to the SMEs or MSMEs who, as Opeyemi said, governments don't trade, but also opportunities to learn from other trade agreement. What opportunities can we learn? I am aware under the Commonwealth Secretariat, you've done a lot of work on capacity building, educating, working with SMEs to ensure they have market access, but also competitive market access, right? So AfCFTA, I hope that it's 2 years on, right? And we're still talking about grand opportunities. I think our citizens are getting a little bit impatient and want to see some of these problems. And it's not very difficult to implement. When you tell us that we're going to create 30 million jobs in 2050, or you're going to grow Africa's GDP by 8%, which is almost about 50 billion to our export revenue. They want to see it now. Traders and citizens want to see these benefits now, but it's not going to be an easy walk. I believe there's been a lot of investment within the AfCFTA Secretariat, and that's great. And I believe the UK and other stakeholders have supported the Secretariat in making sure that they have the structure ready so they can support government. So now what needs to be done is move from the Secretariat and start seeing that in the market. And I think for us, particularly involved in research or engaging with private sector, is constantly feedback the experiences and collaborate across the border to ensure that AfCFTA is implemented. And it's not going to take governments; it's going to take each one of us. And I believe we all have in our various positions, we have a role to play. But as I said, stakeholders really engage. In terms of trade agreement, negotiation, or any agreement, please engage at the regional level. I think when you engage at individual country level, then you're dividing and dragging the implementation process. Trade finance, I think the role of DFIs, the African DFIs, Afrexim Bank, and the other Africa Development Bank, TDB, and others, really making sure that finance is actually accessible to SMEs. Jonathan, I'll leave it there for now and hear from the other speakers.
Thank you, Agnes. Let's come back to the room. I mean, I suppose if we let's almost circle back to where we started, which is just sort of a period of kind of external shocks, external crises, something you've done a lot of work on. I mean, to what extent does, and people have alluded to this, but to what extent does greater trade integration, regional integration, to what extent does that offer us a shock absorber, against those external shocks?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, it's a very good question. It's partly I think Dirk and myself have been in a conference last week looking at those shocks funded by IDRC across the continent. And we were looking at the Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia impact on trade, on food security in Africa. So those kind of shocks would be common, I think. The more, we are integrated, and the global economy, Africa integrated, the more shocks will come. The question is, do we have the response or the institutional mechanism to deal with it? I think that's the issue. Now, from the various studies we conducted, IDRC funded, ARC also, I'm involved there. We did a lot of these regional integration studies. Now, what are the opportunities? One of the opportunities, there will be huge potential for goods trade. We estimated about an increase of at least 20%, and if non-tariff barriers are included, this will be double. That's one opportunity. Now, the second opportunity is we did also a study with Dirk on Ethiopia, in particular on ODI ODI trade integration studies. And what we saw was that the CFTA leads to the coming up of other protocols, including, the service that she mentioned, the investment protocol we worked on. So all these incoming protocols will build onto the safety framework. So the safety gives an opportunity as a framework to include other relevant policies to withstand shocks. So that's the advantage I see. Now, the other thing is the number of empirical studies we did. We came up that there is one of the challenges of regional integration in Africa is two challenges basically. Number one is trade complementarity. Almost we all sell primary commodities, and manufacture export at the share of total merchandise export is not more than 12 or 13%. So that's the fundamental problem. But it is also an opportunity, because it means that there is a need to build the capacity on manufacturing, on investment, and the more you tune your economy to manufacturing, to diversification, the more resilient you will be. You will not be vulnerable like the commodity price shock of 2030-40, for instance. Or you will not be very happy like the Chinese period of 2000 to 2030, where commodity price went up, African growth become 5% plus. So that kind of vulnerability could be addressed precisely because of the limited the intra-Africa trade, i.e. We sell primary commodities, we import, as the ambassador said, almost all manufactured goods from outside, except in Southern African countries where South Africa supplies manufactured goods. Now, that's number one. Number two problem is, even if, in some of the studies we did, even if we pick up some relatively competitive manufacturer suppliers of Africa, we found about 7 of them, like Tunisia, Morocco, South Africa, to some degree Kenya. So this, when you compare them with the current suppliers, they are half at the competitive level in terms of comparative advantage, i.e. the Chinese can supply at half price than the African potential supplies for the rest of Africa. Now, I see there the opportunity, therefore, for investment in manufacturing and diversification. In short, structural transformation or industrialization. Why is this interesting? For two reasons. Number one, manufacturing is historically, as you know, manufacturing is the most important tool to reduce poverty. It creates job, huge job. That's what happened in Asia, and reduce poverty. Number two, manufacturing also, take us to the resilience that you just mentioned, the chair mentioned earlier. Now, then, what was the problem? Therefore, we did also study, the export supply problem of Africa, as she mentioned. We found a number of problems, but basically, the fundamental problem was, let me see it here. This is, the African export manufacturing was weak, precisely because of weak infrastructure, low productivity and trade facilitation. In short, acute export supply constraint that characterizes the African export trade. Now, this calls for an innovative approach to enhance intra-Africa trade and further regional integration, and addressing the challenge of export supply constraint, export competitiveness, and diversification opens the opportunity for regional investment, not only by within the region, but also by development partners in Africa. So what will be, for instance, the implication of this for UK? The last question was pretty much that. Now, since this building resilience, diversification, and job creation, hence poverty reduction, requires provision of regional, multi-country, and domestic infrastructure. Because the logistic cost is the most expensive across the continent, the most expensive in the world. So this gives the opportunity, as Ambassador said, not only on airlines, but also on road infrastructure, rail infrastructure. So that's another opportunity it offers. Harmonizing macroeconomic and trade policies, including trade facilitation, is another area where jointly Africans and development partners can work on. As well as regionally focused diversification plan. Regionally focused, sometimes we take it the whole 54 countries and it will be difficult. So, regionally focused, using the current regs as a base, and some kind of diversification industrialization strategy, I think, is required with all what is needed. Now, development partners, including UK, need to work on manufacture production and export potential of its African partners. For instance, if you go Ethiopia in Kenya, export is the fundamental problem. Kenyan, I did both of the country, I studied both. And export diversification is the key problem. In Ethiopia, for instance, if you see, we have only probably 1.5 months of reserve to import. And this is because our export is 3.5 billion, while our import is 18 billion, 6 times. And the export in the last 10 years grow only by 3.5% per annum. And according to my competition, our export need to grow by 28% per annum for consecutive 8 years to solve our foreign exchange problem. The same in Kenya. That huge depreciation that you see in Kenya has to do with structural trade deficit in Kenya. Therefore, say if you take UK and invest in the area, number one, it's best for structural transformation and industrialization. Number two, it is effective for job creation and poverty reduction and address limitation of the African continental free trade area, non-complementarity of trade that I mentioned. And certainly, it will be a win-win outcome both for UK and its development partners. I should stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Dominic, I have not forgotten you, but I'm gonna pass the mic to Opie, who'd like to just respond on this one.
Yeah, I just thought, because you said we should make it interesting, I suppose, to go back and forth and have a bit of chat. Just picking up on what he's just said about the opportunities, thank you, sir, for manufacturing. I mean, I think that the data and the statistics actually show that intra-Africa trade, though low, is actually more in the manufactured goods compared to our trade with the rest of the world. So with Europe, with a lot of our, trade partners, we trade more commodities, but amongst ourselves, the statistics actually show that we are trading some sort of manufactured goods. And so this is where the advantage is, that we can take that, that opportunity that's already existing in the market and grow it, okay? Because perhaps then we can create some trade diversion. If you say, for example, that it is more expensive or it is cheaper for someone to import something from China to Ethiopia, perhaps if the AfCFTA confers the right kind of advantage that we are trying to create with that agreement, we can create a trade diversion that allows the importer from Ethiopia to get those products or to source those products from South Africa if it's available, or from Botswana, rather than going all the way to China. And these are the kind of realistic solutions that our policymakers need to think about. How do we change that narrative? Because perhaps maybe one of the reasons why intra-Africa manufacture isn't, our exports are more of manufactured is because the standards that we would expect, it's not, compared to if you wanted to export a cosmetic to the UK, for example, you would pass through the eye of a needle to go through some of those sanitary and phytosanitary standards. But perhaps if you wanted to export it to Ethiopia or Kenya, same standards, not like the standards are lower, but you probably get a bit quicker getting through that border compared to if you wanted to take it to the EU. So I think that the opportunities are there, and the statistics show us that we have an opportunity to grow that manufacturing base for intra-Africa trade. So for me, what you just said now triggered that thinking that it's not all bad news when it comes to our manufacturing intra-African trade, because it is already existing in some shape or form, and we can grow it. This is where the AfCFTA should be conferring an advantage that creates that diversification. And then perhaps when we grow that capacity within the region, we can then look to export it to the EU, to the UK, or to the US, as the case may be.
Thank you, Abby. Dominic, I'm going to bring you in with a sort of, I mean, I guess a sort of private sector hat on.
I'm here.
Yes. I mean, I suppose just broadly, I'm keen to get your sense. Just, I mean, it really is just a sort of broad response in terms of, you know, both a question of kind of, you know, sort of market attractiveness coupled with, you know, just kind of difficulties of market access, and sort of, you know, how are private sector firms seeing those two pull factors?
Well, first of all, I think all the comments have been fantastic, and the feedback, despite Dirk covering most of it in his opening remarks, I think we've gone a lot further and a lot deeper, which has been a fantastic way to set this conversation. But what I would say is that the comments and the challenges, with or without the AfCFTA, remain repetitive, and they have not moved away from the narrative of what the private sector, and most importantly, what the people of Africa are facing. I'm excited and confident that the AfCFTA is one of the right mechanisms to overcome the challenges of trade in the continent and outward trade from the continent. But even with the most beautifully worded agreement, which I know a number of people at this session today have had inputs on or been part of the work groups or personally involved in the negotiations on ratifying the AfCFTA, without access to finance, as we've heard about, without border crossings that actually work, and without a buy-in from people on the AfCFTA and the importance of cross-border trade, there will not be the magnitude and shift that we're all hoping for. And that's where I think we have to remind ourselves and come back to the question of, how are we going to get borders working in Africa? Well, we know how, and there are organisations that have increased trade. Mombasa to Rwanda has transit time has decreased, what, 70–80%? The costs have decreased somewhat by almost 90%. Idling times at Mombasa port used to be 21 days for containers. It's come down significantly. So Africa can and has improved its trade environment, and the work that was done in Kenya enabled me to invest heavily, creating 6,000 jobs in Nairobi. But 10 years ago, I wouldn't be investing in Nairobi or Kenya, for that matter, because if I had goods sitting at ports for 21 days, there was no business to be investing into. It wouldn't have been possible to trade. So we see some really fantastic examples, such as the EAC and the work on interregional trade working there prior to the ratification of the AfCFTA. But we also see setbacks. You know, the port in Durban is faced with a lot of challenges. We have this fantastic port in Berbera, which I have visited. I've also travelled the entire Berbera corridor. But with all due respect to the Somaliland people of Somalia and the people of Ethiopia, the Togwajale border crossing can handle 9 containers a day, whereas Berbera port is designed to handle about 3,000. So we've had $600 million go into a port which can't get goods into or out of Ethiopia to the extent that people would like to. And that is not a fact. I've seen it. It's chaos, and we have huge visions and huge ambitions, rightly so, to continue to support the incredible growth that we're seeing in Ethiopia, the people of the region, and most importantly, bring some stability to the conflict that we see by creating jobs, getting people out of famine, getting foods on tables. That's not going to happen if we don't remove these non-tariff barriers. But most importantly, if we don't invest into the border posts, the training, the digitization, it all goes hand in hand. So I'm very excited about the AfCFTA. I think it's a huge opportunity for foreign investors to reach deeper into the continent of Africa, beyond, say, the usual countries such as Ghana, Morocco, Kenya. How do we get foreign businesses, non-African based businesses invested in and supporting? But a really important point that I've heard twice today, and I hope to hear more of, is that we've got to make sure Africa is not exporting raw materials, but the manufacturing of goods in Africa is increasing, the raw materials that is in the land, in the soil of Africa. We have to see exports of manufactured goods go up and exports of unprocessed raw materials go down. And until that happens, we are going to be continually looking at huge trade gaps. We're going to look at continued youth unemployment. We've got to bring the value to Africa that we have taken away, and we have to help Africa build its future. And the AfCFTA is a huge opportunity for that. At the moment, you have a 90-mile tailback between Zambia and the DRC. You know, there's a huge vision of an electrification of car empire, so to speak, in that part of Africa, which I think is really exciting. Everything is in the ground to make that happen. But if you can't move copper to the DRC, that's not happening, really. Let's be frank. So in some respects, it's a bit like the cart before the horse. And I want to make sure that we give the AfCFTA the best chance possible. We can't lose sight of the investments that have been made, but need to be made in much more pace. I mean, Dirk can talk more to the Abuja-Abidjan corridor. There was comments earlier about 57 checks between Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, it just is not, there's no appetite for businesses to come and invest with those kind of statistics. Now, if you're in the oil and gas world and you build your own pipe from a field all the way out to the sea, you don't have those problems, but also the money doesn't stay in the country. We know that. There's lots of oil leaving Africa and not lots of money going back in. So the big businesses, with or without the AfCFTA, will thrive. I think the medium-sized businesses like me, we're very strategic in where we invest and making sure that we can get access to ports and get access to ships calling at those ports. But really, the AfCFTA for me is about the women and youth of Africa. It's about the small enterprises, the young entrepreneurs, or the older entrepreneurs, the day traders, the cross-border traders, you know, the billion-plus people on the continent that need and deserve to benefit from the AfCFTA. And that will transform the continent. Once we get the costs out of the way, the barriers out of the way, and empower people on the continent to trade freely and profitably, then the AfCFTA, for me, it serves a huge opportunity to make that possible.
Dominic, I'm going to put a question to you and then also open it up to everyone else. And it's sort of a conundrum that I find, or a puzzle, rather than necessarily a question. Kudos to the AfCFTA Secretariat. They've got a reporting mechanism. People have mentioned it. You can go onto a website. People can sort of report NTB problems, and you know, in theory, they're meant to be dealt with. And I took a look at that a year ago, just after they launched it, and there were about 3 complaints up there, and none had been resolved. And you sort of think, well, you know, January 2021, you know, or February, whenever, you know, back in the day, that's what, you know, you might expect that. But if one looks at it today, or last night as I did, there is 1 resolved complaint, which already is a bit worrying. But perhaps even more worrying is the number of complaints that have gone in is less than 50. It's a handful. And that sort of says to me, either people have no faith in the process. There are clearly problems that need to be reported. Either people have no faith that they will be dealt with, or they have no particular desire, you know, to be sort of importing or exporting across those borders. they've got nothing to buy or sell, or just are getting it from China, so they're not even bothering to make complaints because they're not trading. How does one explain this conundrum that we have so many NTBs but so few reported problems?
It's a good question, Jonathan. I suspect it comes down to how well people know that they have an ability to complain. I wonder how many people are familiar with the mechanism. I wonder how many people are familiar with the AfCFTA, let alone the complaints mechanism that the AfCFTA has facilitated. And that's what I mean about the steps that need to be taken. I think His Excellency Wamkele Mene is just doing an incredible job trying to get the word and the message out there. But it does require all the members to also boost and promote awareness of the AfCFTA and the resources which the AfCFTA can provide. I would like to see, maybe Dirk and some of the economists and researchers today could look at how many complaints have been raised outside the AfCFTA in previous years. Are we seeing a lot of mediation being done around other EPAs or RECs? I don't know how much complaints happen in those. We might find it's also very small. So if that is the case, and it's a theme across various trade initiatives where there are dispute resolution mechanisms not being used, then I suspect also highlight that people are not using the system to its fullest. And that's something that we all need to get behind and support to make sure the system is used as it's designed, that it is promoted in a way that people understand. I mean, one of the crazy things, just to finish on this point, Jonathan, is that something like 80% of cross-border contracts in Africa are done under English law and arbitrated in London at the London Dispute Resolution Centre, just around the corner from where you're sitting now. That for me would be a good area to go and understand how much is actually being disputed. But actually, we need the AfCFTA to settle these disputes. We need the RECs to do it. It needs to be Africa to Africa. I mean, imagine the cost that you're a business in Benin and you've fallen out with someone in Malawi and you have to fly to London and you've got to get London lawyers and expertise involved. And actually, it's an interregional challenge. So I would like to see this disputes mechanism work. I would like it to be, it has to be run by Africa for Africa. Of course, London can support with its knowledge and expertise and transfer where required. But we should be looking at how much disputes are settled through these mechanisms and how we can support people to do it more so and in continent as well.
Thank you. Since possession is 9/10 of the law, Ambassador, I'm going to get to you, but Dirk is holding the conch. So we'll let you have a...
Thank you. I suppose I haven't looked at NTBs in particular on the AfCFTA Secretariat. We've done in the past in the EAC. But it's a good thing that these issues are now coming up. And I think that, so last week or a week and a half ago, I was in Kenya and I spoke to someone who had sent a consignment under AfCFTA rules from Kenya to Ghana, and all the issues that she had to go through to get everything certified, and it took a long time. And so some of those issues are now being documented, and they're now being made aware. Others are now being made aware of what are the steps you have to go through, and also some of the issues are being resolved. And so she's actually done it basically. So and that involves also matchmaking. It's only at a tiny scale, right, at the moment, but something is happening. So it's the AfCFTA and the GTI is more than just a trade agreement. It's also about matchmaking. It's slightly more. It's a very small scale, and it needs to be done much more. And it's a step. And I agree that NTBs are a big problem. And there are agencies and organizations like Trademark Africa, for example, who are trying to resolve issues at the border. And they look at, for example, they use one-stop border posts to resolve issues. And part of it is hard infrastructure, but most of it is actually soft infrastructure to harmonize regulation or in other ways to overcome NTBs. And that's now been successfully implemented in East Africa. And the question is, can this now be also implemented continent-wide? And can sort of the AfCFTA maybe coordinate some of those issues, more corridor approaches across the continent? And that would be fantastic. And I think if the AfCFTA leads to all these other things, that would be fantastic. We all hope it can lead to manufacturing, production, industrialization, regional value chains. At the moment, of course, the AfCFTA it remains mainly a trade agreement, a bit like the WTO, right? It's a trade measures. But just like Ngozi, Director General from WTO would like the WTO to be more than just trade, like trade and health, trade and climate, trade and other things. That trade is helps to address everyday's problems. So also, I think the AfCFTA could think about it, and then it has a chance to do more and to solve everyday's challenges. I mean, both Dominic and I were at the business forum in Cape Town, and there we were talking about, for example, pharmaceuticals value chains, where there are 54 or 55 differentiated markets in Africa, where there need to be standards that need to be harmonized, or there needs to be, and that's a long-term agenda. So the private sector does know that this is a long-term agenda. This is not like something that can be done now. Overnight. It's a long-term agenda. So I think if the AfCFTA supports that, so if it on the one hand has an action agenda through national implementation committees and also through private sector action plans, which are currently being developed by the World Economic Forum, and we help with that process. If you have an implementation plan, but at the same time also have long-term ambitions, and if these are converging, both with public and private sector, then I think there's a reasonable chance. And it is not something we need to leave on its own. We need to work at it. Everyone needs to work at it. Everyone needs to. It's hard work. Different agencies have, with all the comparative advantages, need to work at it. But the problem of NTBs remain at the moment.
Thank you. Could we pass that on?
Thank you. I think the Continental Free Trade Area is at a formative stage at the moment. And from Africa's experience, we have local laws and regulations. And on top of that, we have experience of doing business between the regional economic communities. Apart from that, we don't have harmonized laws, regulations, and infrastructure. Without this, we cannot jump into the Continental Free Trade Area practice. So in the short term, I think we have to harmonize our laws and focus on what we can do in terms of diversification and in terms of sharing our products in the region and continental-wise. But in the medium term, we need to focus also on building infrastructure. We need energy, we need roads, railways. From what my sister here said, there is a long queue on the custom checkpoints. Why does that happen? Maybe because of customs laws that does not complement each other across the borders. So this has to be solved in the short term. And then again, invest on infrastructure and the connectivity, on digitalization, and also learn from other unions like European Union and others. How do they do that? So with this, we can move to the long-term plans and implementations. I think African leaders have shown willingness to create a continental free trade area. But we have only the experience of regional economic communities. How can we bring these 5 regional communities into a continental integration? So that work has to be done, that homework has to be done. And our partners like the UK can support us in this area by trade and investment facilitation measures, streamline customs procedures, and improving infrastructure as well. The April summit on UK-Africa investment can also contribute in this, in harmonization of policy and sharing of experience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you again, John, for that question. I'm just thinking about the NTBs and the reporting mechanisms and that process. And I'm thinking, again, perhaps this is where, and I know you've done a bit of work on national implementation committees, and perhaps this is where the value of those committees would come in. Because it might be that the officer who's seeing those, who's designated in the AfCFTA to see those complaints comes from the Ministry of Trade, because they are the ones responsible for negotiating the agreement. But this is a complaint that's something to do with customs, or perhaps some of the other agencies that work in the border. So how do we ensure that that complaint is getting quickly to the right person or organized or agency in the country so that it can be resolved quickly? That is also something that they probably need to look at. But one of the things that I see, again, and I was last week, interestingly, I was in Joburg. We were trying to look at the possibility of developing an e-commerce framework for the SACU region. Now, the impact and the capacity of digital trade to really improve or expand the potential of the AfCFTA cannot be overemphasized. There's a lot of data that's shown that if we do the digital trade, it would open up the market and the opportunities. But the question is, and this is what I said, policymakers are talking to each other, but are the private sector talking to each other? And I am very glad that you're doing something around that based on what you've just said. Because, for example, like I was looking at, when you talk about e-commerce, there's a lot of play in digital money. The for instance, M-Pesa in Kenya, and all of those services, financial services that can help to make e-commerce work in many of our countries. But other telecommunications companies in Africa talking to each other. I gave an example of if you use a phone in the UK and you go to Europe, you can use the same phone, maybe pay a little depending on the kind of data services you have. And I was shocked that I got to South Africa and my mobile phone company here in the UK told me I could use my phone in South Africa to make calls and do everything I need to do without needing to get a South African SIM, without needing to pay for data, without any of that. But if I took my MTN from Nigeria to South Africa, I cannot use it without paying exorbitant roaming charges. So these are some of is that interoperability of systems that African leaders need to talk about. And it's who's bringing those big private sectors. And I'm again going back to services, the telco companies, the transport companies, who's bringing them together to the table to say, okay, we want to see a change. How do we work together to ensure that we make our systems interoperable? Everyone wins. You still get paid. I get paid. But I think that's, for me, it's still that absence of that big private sector participation in the conversation, because they can resolve it quicker than what the governments can do. The governments could make the policies, but if the big CEOs aren't in the room to talk about these issues, it might still be a long way to go. So this is just some of my own thoughts.
Thank you. Dirk, was that you'd like to comment, or just?
Just on the, the private sector issues, I think there are some things are happening. So the AAAM, for example, it has a regional automotive position, and also the AfCFTA Secretariat has a private sector development strategy based on 5 sectors, 5 regional value chains, so agriculture and garments and textiles and pharmaceuticals, and there's also a sector on ICT and with the World Economic Forum Africa, and at the Cape Town Business Forum, there was also a meeting with Wamkele Mena, the Secretary General, to think through a private sector action plan and to sort of align private sector action, including with ICT companies, with some of the efforts of the AfCFTA Secretariat. but it's a long-term agenda, and as you say, it's not the regional level or continental level, but it's also at national level that things actually need to happen, and their national implementation committees, I think, hold the key to some of it, and there it's not about forms of committees, it's about functions, is what they actually do. That is the most important one, not about, well, we have another 20 people working on certain things. It's actually whether they are coordinating action, whether they are solving investor problems and so on. And I think that's key. And I think that's what we now need to see happening.
Thank you. Could we have a mic that goes to the audience? Oh gosh, and there are lots. So David was first in the front. In the front row first. And should we take these in sort of groups of 2 or 3, or should we? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, David Luke. I think the question will be for Agnes, actually. And that is also to remind everyone that the same day that the AfCFTA agreement was signed in 2018 in Kigali, another protocol was opened up for signature, and that is a protocol on the free movement of persons. I do recall that in Kigali, you could see so many heads of states signing the AfCFTA agreement, but I believe only about 3 actually signed the second protocol. But we do know that practices in East Africa, in West Africa, do facilitate movement, although not to the extent of yet of fully going down the direction of recognizing professional qualifications, etc., which would make movement, So I just, for Agnes, just to update us on what the status is in East Africa on free movement and what you see as the potential. And then the second question, I think, will be for Dirk, which I know that, Dirk, you've tried to advise on the investment protocol. But the latest version of the protocol I've seen does not really address this problem of the race to the bottom, in the sense that all the bilateral protocols that African countries have would remain as they are. And these are generally competitive and so on. Even the dispute resolution processes that Dominic was talking about would remain as they are, even though there's a dispute resolution system that's embedded in the AfCFTA Secretariat. But more than that, even if I, as an African, although of course the protocol does provide for facilitating investment, inter-African investment and so on, but even if I, as an African, would want to not have the confidence that I would have the protections that I want under the protocol, I could go do a postbox company in Amsterdam, so that I could benefit from bilateral with Amsterdam and so on. So not having addressed this problem of the race to the bottom, what do you see as the risk? Because one of the promises of the AfCFTA is that it would facilitate investment, it would on the same, now level the playing field and so on. So I think there is an issue there which we still need to think through. So those would be my 2 questions. Sorry if I took too long.
No, thank you. Would you mind handing the directly behind you there? There we go. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Desne Masi, and thanks very much to the panel. I just want to reiterate David's point about the protocol with freedom of movement for people, because from the private sector, this is what we hear quite a lot in terms of what would make the single market work, because the 4 freedoms of the European Union are capital, goods, services, and people. So Dominic, I just would put that to you in terms of a private sector view, because people are often complaining they can't get visas for people between countries as well as countries outside of Africa. And then Dirk, a question for you. Considering Brexit, is it politically coherent for the UK to be advising on AfCFTA? What are the views from the EU and the BRICS? And then Obi, you mentioned green minerals and ESG and climate. But I think the thing is with all these green minerals is like the decent labor issue. And I don't hear labor rights talked about enough. There's some horrendous stories we see from some of these mines, especially for components for EV vehicles? And then finally, where are we in terms of just actually making an AU bloc? I mean, I realize some countries want to maintain their sovereignty, but, because some people say it doesn't make sense for Africa to be like going to Africa UK forums, there should be single country to single country engagement. So I'll stop there. Where are we in terms of an AU bloc, to anyone who wants to answer?
Okay, and can we bring it to this side, please, in the middle towards the back? And I'm going to make an appeal. We're in an inflationary environment, but this kind of question inflation is runaway. So there we go. Thank you. Yes, this gentleman, please.
Yes. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Right. Just a bit of a comment, I would say, because the discussion took a really interesting tone towards the end when we started talking about digital trade, digital services as well. And that got me thinking, the crux of the discussion was about manufacturing, trade and manufacturing services. And of course, that's fundamental to the growth of the economy of Africa, as well as to the economy of the whole world. We're still very dependent on manufacturing goods, but all across the world, emerging economies, developed economies, they're transitioning significantly at an accelerated pace towards the production and the export of financial services, technical services, technological services, ICT services. And even in Africa, we see that there is potential. For example, there are regional hubs in Cairo, in Cape Town, in Lagos, in Nigeria, where dedicated tech hubs are emerging, but just not at the same pace. So when we talk about the role of AfCFTA with regards to facilitating trade all across Africa, and we look at the need to incorporate as much digitization, as much ICT support in manufacturing trade as well as services trade, we see that there's a disparity in Africa. We see that there are regions which are very significantly far behind, and there are few centers which are significantly ahead. Now, of course, everyone in the UK is familiar with the concept of leveling up. When we say that the South is significantly better than the North, and there's an inherent responsibility to bring the whole region, bring the whole country up to scale. So along those lines, just what can the roles and responsibilities of the AfCFTA be to guarantee a level playing field with regards to digital services growth, digital services trade all across Africa?
Thank you. I think we've got it. I'm going to take two more people, and the one right in the front here, please. And then secondly, the gentleman in the gray.
So I'm going to attempt a series of one-liners because I know time is very, very short. So first of all, across the borders from Badagry to Abidjan, those 54 are not only on the borders. This is something from an ECOWAS shippers group, okay? It's the borders and within the countries, okay? So it's not only an AfCFTA thing. Within the countries itself, we are all suffering. When you're going from one part of one country to the next part of another country, it's the same checkpoints. So let's tell our national leaders, get rid of all of them. Once they do that, the number of AfCFTA checkpoints goes down to like 7 or 8, okay? That's number one. Success story. The same Abidjan to Badagry is like a huge urban area, okay? There's no space in between them. Those guys are really growing and they're really trading with each other. Warning, those who are making the data, we have next to no data on within African trade. All the things we're saying is pure speculation. Right now, we are in the rainy season in Ghana. Maize, which is a crop I study, in the rainy season gets aflatoxins. All the people from Burkina Faso, they come south and they just swoop up all of this maize, take it north to dry. Then when the prices go up in Ghana, they sweep them all back down. And there are no borders there. Nobody is counting this stuff. It is amazing, okay? So we need to sort of like cherish the successes. And then finally, one-liners. P.T. Bauer, he's from the United Kingdom, London, so we need to mention it. He spoke about free trade in 57. Organization of African Unity spoke of free trade in 61. ECOWAS was in the 70s. They've talked, and by the way, if you're going between ECOWAS, if you have a green passport, West Africa, you can go anywhere. I love it, no visa. there have been a lot of successes. We need to praise all of them. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, the gentleman with the grey jacket and red top in the middle. Yeah, you sir, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm glad, that I was invited, to this conference by Prof. Victor Murundi. The reason I'm saying that I'm from Somaliland, I'm from Berbera, and Berbera has been mentioned a lot in this, panel. And if we look, say, Somaliland, a country was destroyed for 20 years, and we are refugees. And that's how I came here to this country myself, though I was a manager in banking. And, we went to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was very welcoming, UK, different countries. But when we defeated, that regime, we all went back, to Somaliland, and we rebuilt our country. There wasn't any university, when we were with Somalia. But now there are 15 universities in Somaliland. It's amazing. And from there, 90% was destroyed in the country. We didn't get that much aid from the international community. I was involved. I'm a Citibank manager as well. I was trained by Citibank, and I was the manager of, credit department in Saudi Arabia about, the Citibank. Therefore, we knew what was happening, but the diaspora rebuilt the country. It's rebuilt now. Now we're talking about Berbera, Traditionally, we are entrepreneurs, Somalis, particularly Somaliland. My grandfather was used to trade with China, with India, all name it, my grandfather. Anyway, we have to move from that entrepreneurship to manufacturing. And that's what's now happening in Somaliland, and it has been started. In Berbera now, and I think our, governor is here of the bank, central bank. One Somali guy who was a small trader about 20 years ago, he invested now $1 million in Berbera for the oil reservation and all this, $1 million. Therefore, if I come to that, what I'm saying here is that corridor that has been talked about, and the ODA is involved, and the UK government is involved, there is a need that to be really joint up way, Ethiopia and Somaliland to work on it. There is some gaps there, and I think the ambassador also knows that, And that was from the beginning, that agreement, but there is some gap, but it's progressing, it's progressing. And the trade between Ethiopia and Somaliland is amazing. You can't, yeah, but what is we need now, Somaliland to move from the trade, because we import everything, our GDP, when you look at everything, our balance of payment. And we did a research, which I will circulate with Cardiff University and myself, 2 professors from Cardiff University. It was funded by, FCDO, and that was 2018. I will send you that report. It was talking about the informal trade in Somaliland. Amazing. 70% of our GDP come from trade. Now we have to move that into manufacturing. But we need the skills. Yeah. We need the education. Human resource is the key. I'm a charter fellow, CIBD here, Chartered Institute of Personnel, in the personnel development in UK. I'm a charter fellow. And the human resource element, the capital, human capital is what is needed in Africa. So you can't just talk. The other final thing I'd like to say is we have to emulate, the tiger economy. Ghana was more, advanced than South Korea in the 70s. But compare now, why? We have to learn from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. So we're in a room full of economists. I've got lots of questions. I've got even more people to answer them. How do we allocate? Should we have a little auction mechanism here? Who wants? Okay, so let's chunk these. A few questions and comments on free movement. Do we have any?
I'll take that, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I think responding to Professor David Luke, who asked the progress of free movement of people in East Africa. So the EAC Common Market Protocol, which was established in 2010, allows for free movement of goods, services, and people from one country to another, members of the EAC. We also have an East African passport. I think ECOWAS also have an ECOWAS passport, but you can also, if you don't have a passport, you can also travel with your national ID, or just a paper from if you're a Kenyan or e-citizen or any other government to show that you're a resident or you're citizen of that country. So that has really worked well, and you can reside and work in any of the member states. There is also ongoing work to recognize academic qualification. You know, Kenyans work across in Uganda, Tanzania, and vice versa. We have Ugandans working in Kenya, Tanzania, and wherever. So that has really worked, and I think that is one of the what has contributed to relatively successful EAC. I'm going to respond maybe to a question that was asked, and I think it's you, Jonathan, who asked why there hasn't been where there's so many questions that have been posted and not resolved under AfCFTA. My thought was the fact that there are questions. I think that's a good thing. It means there is some engagement. I know Ope mentioned the importance of the National Implementation Committee in making sure that the private sector is aware of what the provision under AfCFTA, another system that is provided by the AfCFTA Secretariat. And then finally, I must mention amongst the SME, and I think the gentleman was asking a question, talked about the informal trade and how, even without all this agreement, that informal trade across the borders has remained very successful. And there is very limited data on the volume of informal trade, and I'm sure some organizations have done that. I spent 7 days in Busia border a year ago, and what was interesting for me, most of the women who were crossing the border didn't have smartphones, but what they were using to trade was either their WhatsApp or Facebook, or whoever had Facebook. But most importantly, currency volatility didn't affect them. So a Kenyan would go across the border and use the Kenya shillings to buy something from Uganda. So that was really fascinating at how informal traders are organized. They find solution in the midst of challenges to trade, because for them, this is life and death. If they're not able to sell their tomatoes or oranges across the border, it means they have no money to take their children to school or to pay for other essentials. So there is, I think, government and other players in this space can learn or perhaps facilitate the informal traders. Another example, I wanted to share a really good story of how women SMEs are innovative. Again, this is a Kenyan story. A woman did not have a bank account, and what she did, she approached another woman who had credit with a bank. And so the woman would borrow money because there is trust amongst themselves, would borrow money on behalf of the trader B. And so she becomes like a middleman between herself and the bank. So if the banks do not lend to women, they are finding innovative, or this informative, they're finding innovative ways of going through middlemen. And of course, there is a question of regulation and consumer protection, but people innovate because there is no other way. So I see a lot of potential, but if we can, I think what prompted me to respond to that is the importance of informal trade. If AfCFTA is going to be what it is or be successful, I think the key segment of our market we have to focus on, as much as we focus on the big businesses, I think the informal trade, and we know the value of informal trade, we will need to try and address that.
Thank you very much, Opi. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch very quickly on the free movement question. In the Commonwealth, we recently supported about 3-4 years ago, about 5 years ago now, the negotiations of mutual recognition agreement in the EAC, as a matter of fact, for some service sectors, so architecture, veterinary medicine, and a few of those sectors. And I think the more we have these MRAs signed by countries, then we would start to see professionals being able to move from one country to the other to work. But the question of free movement is going to continue to be political because of the implications that it has. The UK is struggling. Part of the reasons why we had Brexit was especially because of the issues of free movement. So it is a very political issue, and it's not something Africa is likely going to solve in the immediate. Perhaps what we could do as Africans is to introduce e-visas. So you simplify the process of at least getting visas, and that would start to make a bit of a difference compared to when you have to go from one to the embassies to file for visas. And then as the leaders talk more amongst themselves, we can start to see a bit more relaxing of the rules. I mean, I'm Nigeria, and I know Nigeria is probably one of the reasons why Africa will not sign a free movement very soon, because there's way too many of us out there. So it is a real problem. And the Africans need to think about it. Perhaps another option is to think about a business visa. This is what we want to accomplish, to be able to facilitate the movement of business people. And so you can have a scheme that allows business entrepreneurs to register in a scheme that's what they call the however preferred movement, whatever that may be, but that would allow our business people to go from one place to the other. But maybe a full free movement is still a little bit in the future for Africa. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the issue of the labor rights. I think that the more we take on this, the opportunities that exist. A lot of the mines that we're talking about right now are still very informal. There's a lot of artisanal mining for some of these critical metals, and that is why you cannot, they are not as regulated as it should be. And yes, as trade policy officials, we try to not bring trade, and in the WTO, they don't like to talk about trade and labor in the same breath. It has its challenges, but I think that the more countries started to look at these opportunities, and the more we start to integrate these metals in into regional value chains, we would start to see better regulations. We'll start to see better respect for labor rights and for human rights. The last question on the investment protocol, I thought I would touch it because I'm doing a bit of work on investment with the UNCITRAL. I'm in the UNCITRAL working group where we're trying to reform investor-state dispute settlement. I quite agree with you that the investment protocol needs to deal with the issue of the race to the bottom. And we need to, I mean, with the protocol, the challenge would always be the issue of dispute settlement, because some countries have different standards. They want state-to-state disputes, others want ISDS, others want national resolutions for disputes. So this is something that policymakers are going to need to think through. But I think the protocol can still go further. That's my thoughts.
Thank you. I believe that there may have been a sort of comment from online from our, was that Dominic or Agnes?
Yeah, it was myself, Jonathan. Just because I'm going to have to excuse myself, I'm afraid. But I thought Peter, the question around movement of people and what this means for the private sector is a really good question, and it certainly has stimulated the audience as well as the panel. I mean, for me, it's always upsetting to be setting up businesses and not or seeing others set up businesses on the continent and not employ locally. So for me, there's a big issue when there's non-Africans are being employed for jobs that Africans can be doing. That is often because there are visa issues. It's easier to get a visa for someone from Europe or Sri Lanka or India than it is to get a visa for someone from Ghana to come and work in Kenya. So that's definitely a continent issue, which is holding prosperity and growth back. The other thing is, as Dirk mentioned, we were at the inaugural AfCFTA Business Summit in Cape Town. And I was so excited to bump into so many Kenyan friends and colleagues at the conference, but just quickly realized outside of SADC region, there was not many other people from Africa because they couldn't get the visas to South Africa. And because of that, the Kenyans were get an advantage over everyone else because of the new visa-free travel between Kenya and South Africa. So I'm getting called to leave. So I just want to say thank you very much, and it's been a fantastic conversation. And I'm sorry I have to jump out, but look forward to engaging with everyone more.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand it to Dirk last, and this is a hospital pass because if we now run over time, it's your fault, not mine.
Okay, very briefly then. It's a fascinating discussion. I think movement of people is important, and it's not yet sort of dealt with by the AfCFTA agreement at the moment, but of course there might be issues that can be done in the future. The business visa are very important. I suggested an ACP business visa when we were still in the ACP world in 2005-06 as part of a Commonwealth Secretariat book, just to mention that. The investment protocol, really important question there. I think it's not as comprehensive on protection, investor protection, as some of the bilateral investment treaties have been with sort of African countries and with other countries. The protocol says that it should replace all the intra-Africa bilateral investment treaties. But beyond protection, it goes particularly around facilitation, which, as you probably know, and that's also very important. So I think that there is an African voice that on investor facilitation is also very important. So going from a protectionist stance, when it was a Singapore issue in 1996 and so on, at the WTO, to having an African voice that is pro-investment, facilitation seems to me like really important. And if that is a contribution from the AfCFTA agreement, then that is already one thing that is good. And there may be many gaps still and things that can be done. That's good. But there are particular issues that you raised that we can talk about. Brexit, yeah, it is an issue. I mean, I've become British as part of that process, and I'm both Dutch and British. And the Dutch were pro supranational integration without thinking. The Brits were anti supranational structures, perhaps without thinking. I think if we just combine that bit, so let's think more around what is needed when is regional integration useful, what type of structures are needed, that's going to be useful. I think it's a trade agreement at the moment, so the AfCFTA has a mandate from trade ministers, but we hope that other Pan-African instruments can also play an important role, like the African Bank and others and so on. I think that's really important. That's good to see. And regional communities also provide regional public goods beyond just a narrow trade agreement. So I think that is actually a good thing, but it doesn't have to mean that everything needs to be done at regional level. So let's just think about it. And finally, digital, I think, is really important as well. Digital trade, that's really the future as well. There are lots of gaps still at country level. So although there may be a protocol soon to be agreed as part of the phase 2 or phase 3 discussions at the AfCFTA, I think there's still at country level still needs to be done, and perhaps the national implementation committees could perhaps drive some of this process forward, perhaps for the coming 5 to 10 years. Doesn't mean that those national implementation committees have to exist forever, but at least the coming 5 or 10 years, and it's a long-term agenda. Over to you. I want to
There we go. Thank you, Dirk. Look, I'm not going to do a summation. There's other than to say, a lot to play for, lots of work still to be done, as clearly came out in this conversation. Now, at this point, I would normally just say to you, the audience, please put your hands together and thank the panelists because they've been fantastic. But I want you to also thank yourself because you've been a fantastic, engaged, participatory audience. So let's just all give everyone a hand. So thank you.